Coming up, the Minnesota Department of Human Services has a policy that requires hiring justification when seeking to hire a non-underrepresented candidate. In other words, they're explicitly discriminating based on race, sex, and every other protected class. We'll dig into it. The same state agency had to answer tough questions in the Minnesota House Fraud Prevention Committee yesterday, and rather than demonstrate any curiosity as to how to better prevent fraud, Democrat members and their testifiers deflected to complaining about Donald Trump and congressional Republicans. Why is it so hard for Minnesota Democrats to talk about their own policies? Speaking of Trump, his administration has doubled down on the claim that there's nothing to see in the Epstein files. We'll have the latest. I'll introduce you to the Minneapolis version of Zohran Mamdani, a mayoral candidate from our state who seems favored to win and proves just as socialist. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis comes up with an inspired suggestion for Elon Musk, something much better than wasting time on building yet another third party, and you're going to love it. Finally, for X subscribers, YouTube channel members, and audio podcast subscribers, look for today's edition of The Smoke-Filled Room, a supporter-exclusive bonus show where I'll take you behind the scenes of my own family and share what it's like to raise children as an elected official during one of the most polarizing moments in modern political history. Welcome to Closing Argument.
4, 3, 2. Closing Argument with Walter Hudson.
Ten years before I was born, there were still states in the Union where interracial marriage was prohibited under the law. As I grew up, my dad, who is black, warned me of the hostility I would face as a black man in the world as he remembered it. But fortunately, my experience was very different than his. My generation grew up in a post-civil rights era where the dream of Martin Luther King had largely been accepted, and most people were proudly colorblind, judging people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But we've regressed as a society. The left in this country has dragged us kicking and screaming back to the abhorrent premises of Jim Crow. The only difference is they've inverted it. According to them, there's nothing wrong with segregation or discrimination so long as the victims are white. The latest example here in Minnesota comes from the state's Department of Human Services. Alpha News reports that the agency has a new policy which explicitly discriminates based on race, sex, and other supposedly protected classes. The policy reads, quote, "Hiring supervisors must provide a hiring justification when seeking to hire a non-underrepresented candidate when hiring for a vacancy in a job category with underrepresentation. Hiring justifications must be submitted to and approved by DHS Equal Opportunity and Access Division prior to an offer of employment being made." And the policy has teeth. It continues, quote, "Employees may be subject to disciplinary action up to and including termination for failure to comply with policies," unquote. Now imagine, not a single Minnesota state agency employee at any level has been fired for overseeing hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud. No one has apparently been fired for hiring a convicted sex offender to audit finances at the Minnesota Department of Education. Check out my feed for that story if you missed it. But here in this policy, state employees are being explicitly threatened with termination if they simply offer a job to a white man. And that's not an exaggeration. The policy goes on to define what underrepresented means. Quote, "Protected groups include females, persons with disabilities, and members of the following minorities: Black, Hispanic, Asian or Pacific Islander, and American Indian or Alaska Native," unquote. So basically anybody who isn't an able-bodied white man. Now this obviously violates both state and federal civil rights laws. Minnesota House Republican Caucus leader Harry Niska, who is an attorney, minced no words stating such on X, and attorney Rob Dorr, a gun rights advocate who is otherwise fairly moderate, took the analysis further. He wrote, quote, "Under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, employment decisions can't be based on race, sex, or disability, whether it's to favor or disfavor a candidate. Requiring extra paperwork just to hire someone outside of a protected class violates the core promise of equal treatment. Minnesota law is no different. The Minnesota Human Rights Act bars this kind of discrimination in employment. While affirmative action is allowed in certain circumstances, it has to follow specific legal guidelines under Minnesota statute. Demanding a written justification just to hire someone outside a certain demographic and threatening discipline for not doing so doesn't promote fairness. Government agencies can't use race-based policies unless they're strictly focused on fixing specific, proven discrimination. This policy doesn't come close to meeting that standard. This isn't diversity, it's illegal discrimination. Agencies don't get to override civil rights laws in the name of equity, unquote. Ironically, that revelation about DHS hiring policy came mere hours after the department's acting commissioner and recently hired inspector general sat at the testifiers' table answering questions from the House Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Committee. That's a committee on which I serve. It's unfortunate that we didn't get the chance to ask them about that blatant violation of civil rights law on the record. But we did question the adequacy of efforts to prevent fraud stemming from the $20 billion in Medicaid funding, which they oversee. There were several interesting moments from the hearing, but the most interesting dynamic from my perspective was when the Democrat members of the committee chimed in. Rather than address the policies and structure of an agency they've had complete control over in recent years, they decided to deflect, to make political speeches about President Donald Trump and the big, beautiful bill that was just passed in D.C. They lamented the fact that able-bodied Medicare recipients will now have to work, or volunteer, or go to school for at least 20 hours a week. They complained that enforcing those work requirements will make things much harder on county administrators, certainly more so than just letting able-bodied people collect benefits with no questions asked. There were a few noteworthy things regarding how they went about making this argument. First of all, they repeatedly misrepresented the policy change as targeting children, the elderly, and the disabled. But again, we're talking about people between 18 and 65 who are able-bodied. There isn't a single child, elderly person, or disabled person who's going to lose Medicaid benefits because they can't work. Saying otherwise is a flat-out lie, and a contemptible one at that. Second, Democrats don't seem willing to acknowledge that the so-called burden this is going to place on counties was actually created by them, not Donald Trump. You see, there's no requirement under federal law for able-bodied adults to receive Medicaid benefits. Other states, even blue states with larger populations than ours, spend millions less on Medicaid than Minnesota does. And that's because Minnesota Democrats decided to expand benefits to people who would not otherwise be eligible. So if they want to relieve this terrible burden placed upon Minnesota counties, it's simple. Repeal the unnecessary expansion of Medicaid. Problem solved. But the most amusing aspect of this conversation for me was sitting through nearly an hour of Minnesota Democrats complaining about the red tape that new federal law is supposedly going to impose upon state and local government. Because these are the same Democrats who have never seen a mandate upon our businesses or municipalities that they didn't like. Last term alone, they imposed over 65 new mandates on school districts. They passed an intrusive paid family medical leave scheme, imposed earned safe and sick time on top of that, and then layered on an entirely separate pregnancy leave mandate. Not to mention the fact that they raised taxes by $10 billion, all of which comes out of the economy. So to watch these same people complain about having to administer a work requirement for Medicaid, it's a theater of the absurd. Trump Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was grilled by otherwise friendly reporters from outlets like Fox News about the administration's claims regarding the so-called Epstein files. She tried to split hairs about the files being distinct from an imagined client list, but that didn't go over so well with Peter Doocy.
The DOJ and FBI have now concluded there was no Jeffrey Epstein client list. What do you tell MAGA supporters who say they want anyone involved in Jeffrey Epstein's alleged crimes to be held accountable?
This administration wants anyone who has ever committed a crime to be held accountable, and I would argue this administration has done more to lock up bad guys than certainly the previous administration. And the Trump administration is committed to truth and to transparency. That's why the Attorney General and the FBI Director pledged at the President's direction to do an exhaustive review of all of the files related to Jeffrey Epstein's crimes and his death. And they put out a memo in conclusion of that review. There was material they did not release because, frankly, it was incredibly graphic and it contained child pornography, which is not something that's appropriate for public consumption. But they committed to an exhaustive investigation. That's what they did, and they provided the results of that. That's transparency.
Follow up on that,
Sure.
Caroline. Okay, so the FBI looks at the circumstances surrounding the death of Jeffrey Epstein. According to the report, this systematic review revealed no incriminating client list. So what happened to the Epstein client list that the Attorney General said she had on her desk?
Well, I think if you go back and look at what the Attorney General said in that interview, which was on your network, on Fox News.
Got the quote.
Go ahead.
John Roberts said, DOJ may be releasing the list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients. Will that really happen? And she said, it's sitting on my desk right now to review.
Yes, she was
What?
saying the entirety of all of the paperwork, all of the paper in relation to Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. That's what the Attorney General was referring to, and I'll let her speak for that. But again, when it comes to the FBI and the Department of Justice, they are more than committed to ensuring that bad people are put behind bars. They have an operation going on right now called Summer Heat, which has our murder rate trending in the lowest direction in United States history. Their emphasis on violent crime and locking up violent criminals has led to the arrest of 14,000 violent criminals. That's a 62% increase from the same time period last year. So this Attorney General and the FBI Director are committed to putting bad people behind bars where they belong. They promised an exhaustive review. That's what they did. For any further details, I would refer you to the Department of Justice.
The handling of this has been incredibly inept. And that's demonstrated by the fact that you have people like me, an elected Republican, along with conservative commentators like Clay Travis, Glenn Beck, and even Fox News reporters like Ducey, all coming out and railing against the administration for its performance here. And that's actually really encouraging. It's good to know that there remain certain boundaries past which partisan loyalty is no longer expected. Protecting kids transcends politics. Now, even if you give the administration every benefit of the doubt and assume that they're telling the unvarnished truth here, the way they've gone about rolling out these claims and the amount of time it took to do so, and the inconsistency in public statements, all serve to erode public confidence in our institutions. And that's precisely what Trump was elected to fix, not to make worse. I don't see how there's a full recovery from that diminished trust unless there's significantly more transparency. Not just about whatever documents are still out there, but the entire process from the moment Epstein was arrested until now. Were documents destroyed? If so, by who? Was anyone who worked for Epstein ever interviewed by law enforcement? If so, what did they say? I mean, if there's nothing incriminating to anyone outside of Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, why all the cloak and dagger? I wish I had a plausible answer, but I don't. We've spent a lot of time on the program talking about New York City mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani, the open socialist who wants to seize the means of production and effectively enslave American citizens. But I want to draw your attention to another mayoral candidate from right here in Minnesota who fits a similar profile. State Senator Omar Fattah is seeking to become the next mayor of Minneapolis and was just endorsed by SEIU. The Public Labor Union had previously endorsed current mayor Jacob Frey in the past years. And the city has continued to nosedive during those years, but apparently not fast enough for the socialists in our ranks. Now, just to put this into perspective, last year Minneapolis passed an ordinance regulating rideshare companies that was so egregious that both Uber and Lyft threatened to pull out of the Twin Cities metro area for good. During that crisis, Omar Fattah was championing legislation at the Capitol to expand that policy statewide. He was doubling down on a policy even as the harm of that policy was manifesting right in front of his face. And he was so intransigent about it that On the second to last day of the legislative session, with less than 48 hours to go before the constitutional end to our ability to make law, Fattah refused to show up for work and left both his caucus and House Democrats in the lurch. He effectively held the Minnesota legislature hostage, even as it was fully controlled by his own side of the aisle. And by doing so, he put at risk every other legislative priority the Democrats were racing against the clock to pass. And so how did they discipline him? Well, they didn't. Instead, not only did they capitulate, they paraded him out during a late-night press conference and congratulated him on his remarkable leadership. His supporters literally carried him around the Capitol on their shoulders. He was the captain now. This is what's in store for the city of Minneapolis if and when they elect Fattah as mayor. No practicality, no moderation, no compromise, just full-blown socialism. As hard as it is to imagine that Minneapolis could get worse than what we all watched during the 2020 riots, it truly can get worse. And we better brace ourselves for the consequences. As the internet takes sides in the expanding rift between Elon Musk and President Trump, a brilliant solution has been proposed from an unexpected source, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. As you're likely aware, after being one of the most consequential supporters of Trump during the 2024 election, and after being granted the opportunity to bring his innovative business approach to an assessment of wasteful government spending, Musk turned on Trump and the Republican Party after Congress failed to implement his suggestions for budget cuts. Musk's frustration is held by many who expected more from a federal Republican trifecta. But it seems that even Musk's influence could not overcome the calcification of long-established Washington interests. So, what's the solution? Well, Musk suggests starting a third party. We discussed the absurdity and futility of that idea in the last episode. The real problem is not the two-party system. It's the culture which that system reflects. And a third party is not going to change that culture. But DeSantis came out with a much more feasible idea. Instead of wasting money on primarying members of Congress or forming a third party, efforts which will predictably empower Democrats, who will never cut spending, DeSantis suggests that Musk take his vast resources and focus on tilting state legislatures. Now, you could be forgiven for asking how shifting state legislatures will have any impact on federal spending, but there is a way. It's called the Convention of States, and it's an idea that has been well vetted and long championed by conservatives around the country for many decades. Under Article 5 of the United States Constitution, a resolution can be brought from state legislatures to call a convention for the purpose of amending the U.S. Constitution. And that convention would be limited to the tasks assigned to it by those petitioning states. In this case, the three goals that the Convention of States movement supports is limiting federal jurisdiction over the states, imposing term limits on Congress, and imposing fiscal restraint on the federal government, likely in the form of a balanced budget amendment. Now, this idea has real teeth, primarily because it entirely circumvents Congress. If 34 state legislatures pass this resolution calling for this convention, there's nothing Congress can do to stop it. And the good news is that we're more than halfway there. 18 states have passed the resolution, 4 others have passed it out of at least one legislative chamber, and it's been introduced in an additional 17 states. All that adds up to more than enough. And the states who are pursuing this represent the entire political spectrum. Now, there are naysayers of this idea who claim that it opens the door to a runaway convention where radical activists might reshape the Constitution into some sort of modern communist manifesto. But that's literally impossible. First, a convention can only conduct the business granted it under the mandate of the resolution passed by the petitioning states. And many of those states have included punitive measures in legislation for any delegate who exceeds that mandate. But even in the incredibly unlikely scenario where a convention of states proposed egregious amendments, they would still have to be ratified by 38 out of the 50 states. And if you really think that 38 states are going to ratify bad amendments to the Constitution, then I'm not sure what hope we have to fix anything in this republic of ours. That's it for today, unless you're an ex-subscriber, YouTube channel member, or audio podcast subscriber, in which case you can look at my feed for today's edition of The Smoke-Filled Room, my supporter-exclusive bonus show where I get a bit more personal. In today's episode, I share what it's like to raise children as an elected official in one of the most polarizing political environments in modern American history. It's not the type of stuff the typical citizen must contend with. Subscribe now for immediate access. Take care.